Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're diving deep into something that every farmer, whether you're managing 2 acres or 2,000, needs to understand inside and out. We're talking about farm economics. Now, I know the word economics might make some of you think of complicated charts and boring textbooks, but stick with me here, because understanding the economics of your farm is literally the difference between thriving and just surviving. Over the next 12 to 15 minutes, we're going to break down the fundamentals of how money moves through your farm operation. We'll talk about inputs and outputs. We'll explore the real costs of land, seeds, water, energy, and labor. And by the end of this segment, you'll have a clear framework for thinking about profitability in a way that actually makes sense in the real world. So let's get started.
First things first. What exactly are we talking about when we say farm economics? At its core, farm economics is simply understanding how money, resources, and decisions flow through your farming system. It's about knowing what you're spending, what you're earning, and most importantly, where the gaps are. Think of your farm as a living, breathing financial ecosystem. Every decision you make, from the type of seed you plant to the irrigation system you install, creates ripples throughout that ecosystem. Some decisions bring money in, others push money out. And the art of profitable farming is learning how to balance those flows so that at the end of the season, you're not just breaking even, you're actually making money. Now here's the thing. A lot of farmers, especially those just starting out or transitioning from traditional methods, focus almost entirely on production. They ask, how do I grow more? But the better question is, how do I grow profitably? Because you can have the highest yields in the county, but if your costs are through the roof, you're not going to make it. Farm economics gives you the lens to see the whole picture. It helps you understand not just what you're producing, but what it actually costs to produce it, and whether the market price makes the whole operation worthwhile. Let's talk about inputs and outputs because this is where everything begins. Inputs are everything you invest into your farm before you harvest a single crop. We're talking about seeds, fertilizer, water, labor, fuel, equipment, land rent. These are the resources you put in. Think of inputs as the fuel that powers your farming engine. Outputs, on the other hand, are what you get back. This is your harvest. Your vegetables, your grain, your fruit, your fiber. Whatever it is you're growing, that's your output. And critically, outputs are what you sell to generate revenue. Now here's where it gets interesting. The goal of any farm business is to make sure your outputs are worth significantly more than your inputs. That difference, that gap between what you spend and what you earn, that's your profit margin. And in agriculture, margins can be thin. Really thin. So every dollar you can save on the input side or every dollar you can add on the output side matters enormously. Let me give you a real-world example. Let's say you're growing tomatoes. Your inputs might include transplants at 50 cents each, drip irrigation tape, fertilizer, stakes, labor for planting and harvesting, and fuel for your tractor. Let's say all of that adds up to $3 per plant over the growing season. Now, if each plant produces 10 pounds of tomatoes, and you're selling those tomatoes for $2 per pound at a farmer's market, your output value per plant is $20. Subtract your $3 input cost, and you've got $17 in gross profit per plant. Not bad, right? But here's the catch. If a late blight comes through and you lose half your crop, or if market prices drop to $1 per pound because everyone else is harvesting at the same time, suddenly your outputs aren't covering your inputs anymore. That's why understanding this relationship is so critical. You need to know your numbers cold. Now let's talk about land because this is often the biggest economic factor in farming, and it's one that people don't always think about clearly. Land can be owned or it can be rented, and the economics of each are very different. If you own your land outright, you might think, great, no land costs. But that's not quite right, because even owned land has an opportunity cost. That land has a value. You could sell it or rent it out to someone else. So there's an invisible cost to using it for farming instead of other purposes. If you're renting land, the costs are much more obvious. You're paying a landlord a set amount per acre per year. In the Midwest, prime farmland might rent for $200 to $300 per acre. In California, high-value vegetable land can rent for $1,000 an acre or more. That's a real, tangible cost that comes out of your revenue every single year. Here's why this matters. Let's say you're renting 20 acres at $500 per acre. That's $10,000 a year in land costs before you've planted a single seed. If you're growing a crop that generates $15,000 per acre in revenue, you're doing great. But if you're growing something that only generates $800 per acre, well, you can see the problem. Your land cost is eating up more than half of your gross revenue. Smart farmers think carefully about land costs relative to their production system. High-value crops like strawberries or salad greens can justify expensive land. But if you're growing commodity grains, you need cheap land to make the numbers work. And here's something else to consider. Land isn't just about annual rent or mortgage payments. It's also about soil quality. Poor soil means you'll spend more on fertilizers and amendments. Good soil is an asset that pays dividends every season. So when you're evaluating land costs, think about the whole package, not just the price tag. Let's move on to seeds and planting materials, because this is where a lot of farmers, especially newer ones, make critical decisions without fully understanding the economic implications. You've got choices when it comes to seed. You can go with heirloom varieties, hybrid seeds, or in some crops, clones and transplants. And each option comes with different costs and different potential returns. Heirloom seeds are often cheaper upfront. You can save seeds from your harvest and replant them next year, which is great for self-sufficiency. But heirlooms often have lower yields and less disease resistance compared to modern hybrids. So you might save money on seed but lose money on production. Hybrid seeds, on the other hand, are bred for specific traits like high yield, disease resistance, or uniformity. They cost more, sometimes a lot more. And you can't save hybrid seeds, because the next generation won't have the same traits. So you're locked into buying fresh seed every year. But if those hybrids give you 20% higher yields with fewer losses to disease, the extra seed cost pays for itself many times over. Let me give you some real numbers. Let's say you're planting corn. Open-pollinated heirloom corn seed might cost $50 per acre. A high-performing hybrid might cost $150 per acre. That's a $100 difference. But if the hybrid gives you an extra 30 bushels per acre, and corn is selling for $5 a bushel, that's $150 in extra revenue. You spent an extra $100, you made an extra $150. That's a good trade. Now, in specialty crops, the economics can be even more dramatic. In cannabis cultivation, for example, growers pay serious money for premium genetics. A single clone from a proven high-yielding, high-THC strain can cost $20 to $50. But if that clone produces a pound of flower worth $2,000 wholesale, compared to a cheaper strain that only produces 3/4 of a pound worth $1,500, the genetics just paid for themselves 10 times over. The key takeaway here is this. Don't just look at the sticker price of your seed or planting material. Look at the return on investment. Cheap seed that underperforms is expensive. Expensive seed that delivers results is often a bargain. Now we're getting into one of the most variable and, frankly, one of the most confusing cost categories in farming: fertilizers and nutrients. Every crop you grow removes nutrients from the soil. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, plus a whole suite of micronutrients. If you don't replace those nutrients, your yields decline. Simple as that. So you've got to feed your soil if you want your soil to feed your crops. But here's where it gets tricky. Fertilizer costs can swing wildly from year to year. In 2021 and 2022, we saw global fertilizer prices spike to absolutely insane levels. Nitrogen fertilizers more than doubled in price. Farmers who were budgeting $100 per acre for fertility suddenly faced bills of $200 or even $300 per acre. And if you're farming 1,000 acres, that's an extra $100,000 to $200,000 in costs. That'll sink a farm if you're not prepared. So how do you manage this? First, soil testing. You cannot manage what you don't measure. A good soil test costs $50 to $100 and tells you exactly what your soil needs. Maybe you don't need as much phosphorus as you thought. Maybe your pH is off, and that's locking up nutrients you've already applied. Knowing this lets you spend your fertilizer dollars precisely where they'll do the most good. Second, efficiency. There are huge differences in how efficiently different fertilizers deliver nutrients to your crops. Broadcasting dry fertilizer on the surface is cheap and easy, but a lot of that fertilizer gets lost to runoff or volatilization. Injecting liquid fertilizer into the soil near the root zone is more expensive upfront, but much more of that fertilizer actually gets into your plants. So you can use less total fertilizer and get better results. And third, organic matter. Building soil organic matter through cover cropping, composting, and crop rotation reduces your dependence on synthetic fertilizers. Yes, compost and cover crops have costs, but they improve soil structure, water holding capacity, and nutrient cycling. Over time, that reduces your fertilizer bill while improving your yields. So win-win. Here's a real example. A corn farmer in Iowa running a conventional system might spend $150 per acre on nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. That same farmer, using precision application technology, variable rate spreading based on soil tests, and a winter cover crop of legumes, might get the bill down to $100 per acre while maintaining or even improving yields. That $50 per acre savings times 500 acres is $25,000 a year straight to the bottom line. Let's talk about water, because in many parts of the world, water is the single most limiting factor in agricultural production. And even where water is abundant, irrigation costs can make or break a farm's profitability. If you're farming in a high rainfall area, you might think water is free. But even in those places you've got costs. You might need drainage tile to manage excess water. You might need pumps to move water from a pond or stream to your fields. There's energy costs, there's equipment costs, there's maintenance. And if you're in an arid or semi-arid region, water is everything. In California, Arizona, or parts of Australia, water rights can be as valuable as the land itself. Farmers pay for water by the acre-foot, and those costs have been climbing. In some California districts, water can cost $500 to $1,000 per acre-foot. And depending on your crop, you might need 2 or 3 acre-feet per acre per season. So you're looking at $1,000 to $3,000 per acre just for water, before you've done anything else. This is why irrigation efficiency is so critical. An old flood irrigation system might be 50% efficient, meaning half the water you pay for never actually gets to your plants. It runs off, it evaporates, it seeps deep past the root zone. You're literally paying for water that does nothing for your crop. Compare that to a modern drip irrigation system. Drip systems can be 90% efficient or better. Yes, they cost more to install. Maybe $1,000 to $1,500 per acre for a permanent system. But if that system cuts your water use in half, and you're paying $1,000 per acre for water, that system pays for itself in 1 or 2 seasons. After that, it's pure savings year after year. And it's not just about cost savings. In many areas, water availability is limited. You're allocated a certain amount. So using water efficiently means you can farm more acres with the same allocation, or you can switch to higher value crops that generate more revenue per gallon of water used. Here's a concrete example. A lettuce grower in Arizona using drip irrigation and soil moisture sensors cut water use by 35% compared to his old furrow irrigation system. His water bill dropped from $1,800 per acre to $1,100. That's $700 per acre in savings. Over 50 acres, that's $35,000 a year. Plus, his yields went up 10% because the crop was getting consistent, optimal moisture. So he saved money on inputs and made more money on outputs. That's the power of efficiency. Energy is another cost category that's easy to underestimate until you actually sit down and add it all up. And in recent years, energy costs have become a much bigger deal, with fuel and electricity prices swinging up and down in ways that can really impact your bottom line. Let's start with fuel. If you're running tractors, trucks, ATVs, irrigation pumps, or generators, you're burning diesel or gasoline. And fuel isn't cheap. Diesel prices in the US have ranged anywhere from $2.50 to over $5 per gallon in recent years. If you're farming a few hundred acres of row crops, you might burn 1,000 gallons or more of diesel in a season. At $4 a gallon, that's $4,000. And if you're running intensive operations with a lot of tillage, planting, spraying, and harvest passes, that number can easily double. Then there's electricity. Irrigation pumps, especially deep well pumps or high-pressure systems, are massive electricity consumers. Fans and climate control in greenhouses or controlled environment agriculture. Coolers and refrigeration for post-harvest storage. Lighting if you're doing indoor growing or supplemental lighting in greenhouses. All of this adds up fast. A greenhouse grower in Colorado told me his electricity bill runs around $3,000 a month during peak growing season, mostly for climate control and supplemental LED lighting. That's $36,000 a year. And it's a fixed cost he has to cover regardless of how well his crops perform. So what can you do? Well, energy efficiency is step one. Modern variable-speed irrigation pumps use significantly less electricity than old, single-speed models. LED grow lights use half the electricity of high-pressure sodium lights and produce less heat, which reduces cooling costs. Insulating your greenhouse can cut heating and cooling costs by 20 to 30%. And then there's renewable energy, which is increasingly viable for farms. Solar panels have dropped dramatically in cost over the past decade. A lot of farms have huge roof areas on barns and sheds that are perfect for solar installations. In sunny regions, a solar array can pay for itself in 5 to 7 years, and after that you're generating electricity for essentially free for the next 20 years or more. I know a berry farm in California that installed a 100-kilowatt solar array for about $150,000 after rebates and incentives. That system generates about 160,000 kilowatt-hours per year, which offsets nearly their entire electricity bill, about $20,000 annually. So the payback period is 7.5 years, and after that, it's $20,000 a year in savings. The point is, energy costs are real and they're significant. But they're also an area where smart investments in efficiency and renewable energy can generate long-term savings that really add up. Now let's talk about labor, because this is, hands down, the most underestimated cost category in small and medium-sized farming. If you're paying employees, the costs are obvious. Wages, payroll taxes, workers' compensation insurance, maybe benefits if you're offering them. In agriculture, minimum wage applies, but in many areas, you're competing with other industries for workers, so you need to pay more to attract reliable people. Skilled workers like tractor operators, irrigators, or harvest crew leaders command even higher wages. Let's do some math. Say you're running a 10-acre vegetable operation and you hire 2 full-time workers for the growing season, which is about 6 months. You pay them $15 an hour, which is pretty standard in many states for agricultural work. That's $15 times 40 hours per week, times 26 weeks, times 2 workers. That comes to $31,200 in gross wages. But then add payroll taxes about 7.5% and workers' comp, which in agriculture can be another 10 to 15%. Suddenly you're at around $37,000 in total labor cost. For a 10-acre operation, that's $3,700 per acre just in labor. But here's what a lot of small farmers miss. Family labor. If you're out there working 60 hours a week on your farm, that's labor. It's a cost. Even if you're not cutting yourself a paycheck, your time has value. And if you're not accounting for that value, you're not seeing the true profitability, or lack thereof, of your operation. Here's an example. A husband and wife team runs a small pastured poultry farm. They don't pay themselves wages. They just take whatever's left over at the end of the year as income. Last year they grossed $80,000 in sales. Their out-of-pocket expenses were $50,000. So they think they made $30,000. Not bad, right? But wait. They each worked 50 hours a week for 30 weeks of the year. That's 3,000 hours of labor total. If they valued their labor at even a modest $15 per hour, that's $45,000 in labor value. Subtract that from their $30,000 profit, and suddenly they're $15,000 in the hole. They worked incredibly hard and actually lost money on an economic basis. This is why so many small farms struggle. The farmers are subsidizing the operation with their own uncompensated labor. And that's fine if farming is a hobby or a lifestyle choice you're willing to pay for. But if you're trying to make a living, you've got to account for labor realistically. Hidden labor costs are another issue. Training new workers takes time. Fixing mistakes takes time. If you're doing your own bookkeeping, marketing, maintenance, and logistics, that's time. And time is money. The bottom line is this. Labor is often your single biggest cost category, especially in labor-intensive crops like fruits, vegetables, and specialty products. You need to track it, value it accurately, and look for efficiencies wherever possible. Mechanization, better workflows, and good management all reduce the labor hours per unit of production, and that's where profitability lives. Equipment and infrastructure represent some of the largest upfront investments you'll make as a farmer. And these are costs that can really shape your financial picture for years or even decades. Let's start with equipment. Tractors, tillers, planters, sprayers, harvesters, trucks. If you're starting from scratch, outfitting a farm with even basic equipment can easily run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. A good used tractor might be $20,000 to $40,000. A new mid-sized tractor can run $70,000 to $100,000 or more. Implements add up fast. A good field cultivator, $5,000. A planter, $10,000 to $20,000. A sprayer, another $10,000 to $30,000. It's a lot. And then there's infrastructure. Greenhouses, hoop houses, barns, coolers, wash stations, packing facilities, irrigation systems, fencing. A simple high tunnel might be $3,000 to $5,000. A commercial-grade greenhouse with climate control can be $100,000 or more per acre of covered space. A walk-in cooler, $10,000 to $20,000. It adds up fast. Now here's the thing. These are capital costs, meaning you pay them once or you finance them over time, and then you use the asset for many years. So you don't expense the full cost in year one. Instead, you depreciate the asset over its useful life. The IRS has guidelines for this, but typically tractors might depreciate over 7 to 10 years, buildings over 20 years, and so on. But even though you're depreciating the cost, it's still a very real cost. If you borrowed money to buy that tractor, you're paying interest. If you paid cash, that's cash you could have invested elsewhere. So there's an opportunity cost. The key question to ask with any equipment or infrastructure investment is, does this improve my productivity or profitability enough to justify the cost? Let me give you an example. A flower farmer was hand harvesting and bunching flowers, and it was taking forever. She was labor limited. She could only harvest and process so much in a day. She invested $15,000 in a custom-built harvest cart and a mechanized bunching station. That investment cut her harvest and processing time in half, which meant she could either harvest twice as much or reduce her labor hours significantly. She chose to expand production, and her gross revenue went from $60,000 to $100,000 in 1 year. That $15,000 investment paid for itself in one season, and now it's a productivity multiplier every year going forward. On the flip side, I've seen farmers buy expensive equipment that sits idle most of the year. A $70,000 combine that's only used for 2 weeks at harvest time. That's a lot of capital tied up in something that's depreciating and not earning money most of the year. In cases like that, custom hire or equipment sharing might make more sense. The bottom line: be strategic about equipment and infrastructure. Invest in things that directly increase your production capacity, reduce your labor costs, or improve your product quality. And don't overinvest in shiny equipment that looks cool but doesn't move the needle on profitability. Alright, we're coming to the end of this segment, and I want to close with a concept that ties a lot of this together. The difference between variable costs and fixed costs. Variable costs are expenses that change based on how much you produce. Seed, fertilizer, water, harvest labor, packaging materials, fuel for field operations. If you plant more acres, these costs go up. If you plant fewer acres, they go down. Variable costs are directly tied to your production level. Fixed costs, on the other hand, stay the same regardless of how much you produce. Land rent or mortgage, equipment depreciation, insurance, property taxes, year-round salaries for permanent staff, loan payments. These costs are there whether you farm 1 acre or 100 acres. You've got to cover them no matter what. Understanding this distinction is critical for making smart business decisions. Here's why. Fixed costs create a kind of baseline hurdle you have to clear every year. Let's say your fixed costs are $50,000 a year. That means you have to generate at least $50,000 in gross profit just to cover fixed costs before you make a dime of actual profit. The more production you can spread those fixed costs across, the lower your per unit fixed cost, and the more profitable you become. This is why scale matters in farming. A small farm with $10,000 in fixed costs farming 2 acres has $5,000 per acre in fixed costs. A larger farm with $50,000 in fixed costs farming 100 acres has only $500 per acre in fixed costs. The larger operation has way more cushion to absorb market fluctuations and still be profitable. Variable costs, meanwhile, scale with production, so they're easier to control. If the market looks bad, you can plant less, and your variable costs drop proportionally. But your fixed costs don't budge. Here's a practical example. A grain farmer has $200,000 in fixed costs annually. Land rent, equipment payments, insurance, depreciation. His variable costs are about $300 per acre. Seed, fertilizer, fuel, chemicals. He farms 1,000 acres. So his total variable costs are $300,000, and his fixed costs are $200,000, for a total cost of $500,000. If he averages 200 bushels per acre of corn at $5 per bushel, that's $1 million in gross revenue. Subtract $500,000 in total costs, and he's got $500,000 in net profit. Not bad. But let's say he cuts back to 500 acres because of a drought or market conditions. Now his variable costs are only $150,000. But his fixed costs are still $200,000. So his total costs are $350,000, and his gross revenue is $500,000. He's still profitable, but his profit margin is tighter because his fixed costs are spread across fewer acres. Takeaway here is this. Manage your variable costs tightly because those are under your direct control. And think carefully about fixed cost commitments because once you take them on, you're locked in, and you need sufficient production scale to cover them. Alright, that brings us to the end of this segment on farm economics. We've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about what farm economics really means, the critical difference between inputs and outputs, the economics of land ownership versus rental, the real costs of seeds, fertilizers, water, energy, and labor. We've explored how equipment and infrastructure investments shape your operation, and we've broken down the difference between variable and fixed costs. The big picture here is this. Farming is a business, and like any business, profitability comes down to managing costs and maximizing revenue. You can't control the weather, and you often can't control market prices, but you absolutely can control your input costs, your efficiency, and your decision-making. In the next segment, we're going to build on this foundation and dive into how modern technology is transforming farm economics. We'll talk about precision agriculture, data analytics, automation, and how these tools are helping farmers get more output from every dollar of input. Thanks for sticking with me through this deep dive into farm economics. I'll see you in the next segment. When farmers get together, what's the first thing they talk about? Yield. How many bushels per acre? How many pounds per plant? How many tons per hectare? Yield is the universal scorecard in agriculture. And for good reason. Yield matters. Higher yields mean more product to sell, which generally means more revenue. But here's the problem. A lot of farmers, especially those coming from a production-focused mindset, obsess over yield to the exclusion of everything else. They chase maximum yield like it's the holy grail. And in doing so, they often end up losing money. Let me explain. Say you're growing tomatoes. You've got 2 options. Option 1. A high-input system with premium hybrid seeds, intensive fertilization, maximum irrigation, and aggressive pest management. This system produces 60,000 pounds per acre. Option 2. A moderate input system with good but not premium genetics, balanced fertility, efficient irrigation, and integrated pest management. This system produces 45,000 pounds per acre. Now, most farmers would look at that and say, obviously I want 60,000 pounds over 45,000. That's 33% more yield. But let's look at the economics. The high-input system costs you $8,000 per acre in inputs and labor. The moderate system costs you $5,000 per acre. You're selling tomatoes at $1 per pound wholesale. With a high-input system, you gross 60,000 net, 52,000 per acre after input costs. With a moderate system, You gross 45,000 net 40,000 per acre. So yes, the high-yield system nets you 12,000 more. That sounds great. But now let's change one variable. Let's say the market is flooded and tomatoes drop to 75 cents per pound. Now the high-yield system grosses 45,000 nets 37,000. The moderate system grosses 33,750 and nets 28,750. The gap narrowed significantly. And if prices drop to 50 cents per pound, the high-yield system grosses 30,000 nets 22,000, while the moderate system grosses 22,500 nets 17,500. Still better, but the advantage is shrinking. Here's the kicker. The high-input system is more sensitive to price fluctuations because you've got more money tied up in inputs. If anything goes wrong, weather, pests, market crash, your losses are bigger. The moderate system has a bigger cushion. This is why higher yield doesn't automatically mean higher profit. Profit is yield times price minus cost. All three of those variables matter. If you're spending a fortune to chase yield, but the extra yield doesn't pay for the extra inputs, you're actually hurting yourself. The smart play is optimizing for profit per acre, not just yield per acre. And sometimes, that means accepting a lower yield with lower inputs and better margins. Welcome back. In the last segment, we covered the fundamentals of farm economics. Inputs, outputs, and all the costs that go into running a farm operation. Now, we're going to take that foundation and build on it by exploring something that trips up a lot of farmers, especially those who are newer to the business side of agriculture. We're going to talk about profitability. And more specifically, we're going to bust some myths about yield, explore the difference between gross income and actual profit, and give you the tools to understand what it really takes to run a financially sustainable farm operation. Over the next 12 to 15 minutes, we're going to dig into yield versus profit, quality versus quantity, market volatility, break-even analysis, scaling decisions, risk management, and why good record-keeping might be the most valuable tool in your entire operation. So let's jump right in. Now let's talk about quality, because this is where a lot of farmers leave serious money on the table. In most markets, quality commands a premium. A number 1 grade apple sells for more than a number 2. An A grade steak sells for more than a B grade. Organic produce sells for more than conventional. And in specialty markets, quality can be the difference between making a living and going broke. But here's the thing. There's often a trade-off between quality and quantity. Management practices that maximize yield don't always maximize quality. In fact, they often reduce it. Let me give you some examples. In wine grapes, the highest quality fruit comes from vines that are slightly stressed. You limit water, you limit nitrogen. You thin the clusters so each vine produces less. This concentrates the sugars and flavor compounds in the grapes. A vine managed for quality might produce 3 tons per acre. A vine managed for maximum yield might produce 8 tons per acre. But that 3-ton per acre fruit might sell for $3,000 per ton to a premium winery, while the 8-ton fruit sells for $800 per ton to a bulk producer. 3 tons at $3,000 is $9,000 per acre. 8 tons at $800 is $6,400 per acre. The lower yield is worth 40% more. Same thing happens in vegetables. If you're growing salad greens for high-end restaurants, they want tender baby leaves, vibrant color, perfect texture. To get that, you harvest young, which means lower yield per square foot. But those greens might sell for $12 a pound. If you're growing for the mass market, you let the greens get bigger, you harvest more pounds per square foot, but the quality is lower and the price is $5 a pound. Depending on the yield difference, the premium market might be more profitable even with lower volume. And here's another angle. Quality affects your marketability. If you're producing top quality product, you have more options. You can sell direct to consumer at farmers markets for premium prices. You can sell to high-end restaurants. You can build a brand around quality and command loyalty. If your quality is marginal, you're stuck in commodity markets where you're a price taker, not a price maker. You've got no differentiation and no pricing power. So the lesson here is, don't just chase tonnage. Understand your market. If the market rewards quality, optimize for quality. That might mean lower yields but higher revenue per unit, and often better profit margins. Know what your buyers value and produce to that standard. Let's talk about something that keeps every farmer up at night: market price volatility. You can do everything right. You can plant the perfect crop, manage it beautifully, harvest at peak quality. But if the market price crashes between planting and harvest, you can still lose money. And this happens all the time. Agricultural markets are notoriously volatile. Supply and demand shift constantly. Weather affects not just your farm but every farm in your region and around the world. A bumper crop in another state or another country can flood the market and tank prices. A shortage can send prices soaring. Fuel costs, currency exchange rates, trade policies, consumer trends, all of these factors influence prices, and most of them are completely outside your control. Let me give you a real-world example. In 2021, iceberg lettuce in California was selling for $20 to $30 per carton at wholesale. Growers were making money hand over fist. By early 2022, prices dropped to $8 to $12 per carton. Same product, same farms, totally different economics. Why? Oversupply. Too many growers planted lettuce chasing those high prices, and when it all came to market at the same time, prices collapsed. Or look at grain markets. Corn prices in the US hit $7 per bushel in early 22 due to supply chain issues and global demand. By late 23, prices were back down to $4.50. A farmer who locked in contracts at $7 did great. A farmer who waited and sold at $4.50 took a big hit. So what can you do about price volatility? Few things. First, diversify your crops. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. If you're growing 5 different crops and one market crashes, you've still got 4 others to carry you. Diversification smooths out the volatility. Second, timing. If you can, stagger your planting so you're not harvesting everything at the peak of the market glut. Or find ways to store product and sell later when prices recover. Cold storage for apples, potatoes, or onions. Grain bins for corn and soybeans. The ability to time your sales gives you way more control over your revenue. Third, forward contracts and marketing strategies. In commodity crops, you can lock in prices before harvest using futures contracts or direct contracts with buyers. Yes, you might miss out on upside if prices go up, but you also protect yourself from downside if prices crash. It's risk management. And fourth, focus on markets that are less volatile. Direct-to-consumer sales like farmers markets or CSAs tend to have much more stable pricing than wholesale commodity markets. You're not subject to the same supply-demand swings because you're selling locally to a defined customer base. You set your prices based on your costs and desired margin, not on what some distant commodity exchange says. The bottom line is, price volatility is a reality in agriculture. You can't eliminate it, but you can manage it through diversification, timing, market selection, and smart marketing strategies. Alright, now we need to talk about one of the biggest mistakes farmers make when they're looking at their numbers. And that's confusing gross income with net profit. Gross income is easy to calculate. Simply the total revenue you bring in from sales. If you sell $50,000 worth of produce, your gross income is $50,000. Sounds great, right? 50 grand. But gross income tells you nothing about profitability. Because you haven't subtracted your costs yet. Net profit is what's left after you subtract all of your expenses. All of them. Seeds, fertilizer, water, labor, fuel, equipment costs, rent, insurance, loan payments, marketing expenses, packaging, transportation. Everything. If your gross income is $50,000 and your total expenses are $45,000, your net profit is $5,000. That's what you actually made. Here's where farmers get into trouble. They look at their gross income and think, wow, I had a great year. I made $50,000. But they haven't carefully tracked all their expenses. They forget about some costs, or they don't account for their own labor, or they ignore depreciation on equipment. And then at the end of the year, they wonder why there's no money left in the bank account. Let me give you a real example. A small vegetable farmer told me she grossed $75,000 last year and thought she was doing pretty well. But when we sat down and actually added up all her costs, here's what we found. Seed and transplants $4,000. Amendments and fertilizer $6,000. Water and irrigation, $3,000. Fuel and equipment maintenance, $4,000. Packaging supplies, $2,000. Farmers market fees, $1,500. She was paying a part-time employee, $12,000. She was renting land, $6,000. Add in some miscellaneous expenses, and her total costs were around $40,000. So her net profit was about $35,000. Still not bad. But then I asked her, how many hours did you work? She estimated about 40 hours a week for 30 weeks, so 1,200 hours. That means she was paying herself about $29 per hour, which is decent. But if she'd been valuing her labor at even $20 per hour, that's $24,000 in labor value, which would bring her net profit down to $11,000. And if she'd been valuing her time at what she could make working a full-time job elsewhere, say $25 per hour, that's $30,000. And suddenly her farm only netted $5,000. That's a very different picture. The point is, you have to know your true costs, and you have to be honest about what your labor is worth. Because gross income is a vanity metric. Net profit is what actually matters. That's what determines whether your farm is financially sustainable. And here's the thing. A lot of small farms show a decent gross income but have terrible net profit margins. They're working incredibly hard and not actually making money on an economic basis. And that's not sustainable long-term unless farming is a lifestyle choice that you're willing to subsidize with off-farm income or savings. So do yourself a favor. Track every single expense. Build a real profit and loss statement. Know your net profit, not just your gross income. That's the only way to make informed decisions about your farm business. Now let's talk about cost per unit of production, because this is one of the most powerful metrics you can track, and it's something a lot of farmers don't think about. Cost per unit means exactly what it sounds like. How much does it cost you to produce 1 pound, 1 bushel, 1 box, 1 head, 1 bunch, or 1 unit of whatever you're growing? If you know your cost per unit, and you know your selling price per unit, you instantly know your profit margin. And that tells you whether you're making money or losing money on every single item you produce. Let's work through an example. You're growing head lettuce. You've got 1 acre in production. Your total costs for the season, including everything, land, labor, inputs, water, equipment, are $10,000. You harvest 20,000 heads of lettuce from that acre. Your cost per head is $10,000 divided by 20,000, which is 50 cents per head. Now, if you're selling those heads for $1.50 each at a farmer's market, your profit per head is $1. That's a great margin. You're making 100% return on your cost. But if you're selling wholesale at 75 cents per head, your profit is only 25 cents per head. That's a 50% margin, which is still okay but not as good. And if wholesale prices drop to 60 cents per head, you're losing 10 cents on every head you sell. You're literally losing money with every sale. Knowing your cost per unit lets you make real-time decisions. If prices drop below your cost per unit, you know you need to either find a better market, reduce your costs, or stop producing that crop and switch to something more profitable. Cost per unit also lets you compare different production systems. Let's say you're deciding between growing tomatoes in an open field versus in a high tunnel. The field costs you $2 per pound to produce, and the high tunnel costs you $3 per pound because of the infrastructure investment and extra inputs. But field tomatoes sell for $3 per pound, while high tunnel tomatoes, because they're earlier and higher quality, sell for $6 per pound. The field system nets you $1 per pound. The high tunnel nets you $3 per pound. Even though the high tunnel has higher costs per unit, it's way more profitable per unit because the price premium more than covers the extra cost. This kind of analysis is only possible if you're tracking cost per unit. And the more granular you can get, the better. Cost per pound, per box, per unit. Track it by crop, by variety, by planting date, by market channel. The more data you have, the better decisions you can make. And here's a pro tip. Your cost per unit changes with yield. If your costs are fixed at $10,000 per acre, and you produce 10,000 units, your cost per unit is $1. But if you produce 20,000 units, your cost per unit drops to 50 cents. This is why yield does matter, not because more yield is automatically better, but because higher yield spreads your fixed costs across more units, which lowers your per unit cost and increases your margin. It's all connected. Now we're going to talk about break-even analysis, which is a critical concept for understanding the financial viability of your farm. Your break-even point is the minimum level of production or the minimum price you need to cover all of your costs. At break-even, you're not making money, but you're not losing money either. You're just covering your costs. Everything above break-even is profit. Everything below is loss. Knowing your break-even point is incredibly valuable because it tells you the threshold you have to cross to be viable. And it lets you assess risk. If you need perfect weather and perfect markets to hit break-even, that's a high-risk operation. If you can break even with mediocre yields and mediocre prices, that's a much more resilient business. Let's work through a simple break-even calculation. Say you're growing strawberries. Your fixed costs, land, infrastructure, equipment, insurance, are $15,000. Your variable costs, plants, fertilizer, labor, water, are $10,000. So your total costs are $25,000. You're selling strawberries for $4 per pound. How many pounds do you need to sell to break even? Take your total costs, $25,000, and divide by your selling price, $4. You need to sell 6,250 pounds to break even. If you sell more than that, you're profitable. If you sell less, you're losing money. Now let's flip it. Let's say you know you can reliably produce 10,000 pounds of strawberries from your planting. What price do you need to break even? Take your total costs, $25,000, and divide by your production, 10,000 pounds. You need to get $2.50 per pound to break even. If prices are above that, you're good. If they drop below that, you're in trouble. Break-even analysis also helps you make decisions about whether to expand or contract. Let's say you're thinking about doubling your strawberry acreage. Your fixed costs might go up to $25,000, and your variable costs might go up to $20,000, so $45,000 total. But now you're producing 20,000 pounds. At $4 per pound, that's $80,000 in revenue minus $45,000 in costs, so $35,000 in profit. Compare that to the single-acre scenario where you'd net $15,000. Doubling your scale more than doubles your profit. But if prices drop to $3 per pound, your revenue is $60,000, your profit is $15,000, and suddenly the expansion didn't help much. This is why you need to model different scenarios. The key with break-even analysis is to be realistic about your costs and your production. Don't use best-case numbers. Use conservative estimates. If you can break even with conservative assumptions, you've got a solid business. If you can only break even with optimistic assumptions, you're on thin ice. Let's talk about scaling, because there's this pervasive myth in agriculture that bigger is always better. More acres, more production, more revenue. And while scale can be good, it can also be a trap if you're not careful. The benefit of scale is spreading fixed costs across more production, which lowers your per unit costs and increases efficiency. A 100-acre farm can afford a bigger tractor, a more efficient irrigation system, better infrastructure, because those costs are spread across 100 acres instead of 10. This is economies of scale, and it's a real thing. But here's what people forget. As you scale up, your complexity increases. You need more labor, more management, more equipment, more working capital. And if you scale up too fast, or if you don't have the systems in place to manage the increased complexity, costs can spiral out of control. I've seen this happen over and over. A farmer is doing well on 20 acres. They're profitable, they've got good systems, everything's dialed in. So they think, if I can make money on 20 acres, I'll make way more money on 50 acres. So they expand. They take on more land rent, they hire more workers, they buy more equipment, often financed with debt. But now their management is stretched thin. Quality starts to slip. Labor efficiency drops because they don't have good systems for managing a larger crew. Equipment breaks down more often. They're dealing with more logistical complexity, more harvest volume, more post-harvest handling. And suddenly, even though they're producing more, their costs per unit have gone up, not down. Their profit margin shrinks. And if they hit a bad weather year or a bad market year, the debt service on all that expansion can sink them. Here's a real example. A vegetable farmer in Oregon was netting about $60,000 a year on 10 acres. He expanded to 30 acres, thinking he'd triple his profit. But he had to hire 3 additional workers, buy a bigger tractor, rent more cooler space, and take out a loan for infrastructure improvements. His gross revenue did increase, but his costs increased even faster. His net profit dropped to $40,000. He was farming 3 times the acreage and making less money. Why? Because he scaled up production without scaling up his management systems, his efficiency, or his markets. He flooded his existing market channels, prices dropped, and the extra volume didn't help. The lesson here is that scaling has to be strategic. You need to make sure your markets can absorb the extra volume. You need to make sure your management capacity can handle the complexity. You need to make sure your systems, harvest, post-harvest, marketing, bookkeeping, are robust enough to scale. And ideally, you should scale incrementally, not all at once. Test, refine, then scale. Bigger can be better, but only if you do it right. Don't assume that more acres automatically means more profit. Sometimes, optimizing what you're already doing on your current acreage is way more profitable than expanding. Let's talk about risk, because farming is inherently risky, and how you manage risk is often the difference between long-term success and catastrophic failure. There are several types of risk in farming. Production risk, things like weather, pests, disease. Market risk, price volatility and demand fluctuations. Financial risk, debt, interest rates, cash flow. And then personal risk, injury, illness, burnout. Smart farmers don't try to eliminate risk, because that's impossible. Instead, they manage risk. They identify the biggest risks to their operation, and they put strategies in place to mitigate those risks. Let's start with production risk. Weather is the big one. Drought, floods, hail, frost, hurricanes. You can't control the weather, but you can reduce your vulnerability. Diversify your crops so that if one fails, others might succeed. Use irrigation to buffer against drought. Use row covers or hoop houses to protect against frost. Plant windbreaks to protect against wind damage. Get crop insurance if it's available and makes sense for your operation. Pest and disease risk can be managed with integrated pest management, crop rotation, resistant varieties, and good scouting. The key is early detection and rapid response. Waiting until a pest or disease is out of control is way more expensive than catching it early. Market risk we talked about earlier. Diversify your markets, diversify your crops, use forward contracts, and focus on markets with more stable pricing. Don't depend on a single buyer or a single crop for all of your income. Financial risk is about managing debt and cash flow. Debt isn't inherently bad, but too much debt, especially high-interest debt, can strangle a farm. If you're borrowing, make sure the investment generates enough return to cover the debt service and then some. And manage your cash flow carefully. Farming is a seasonal business. Revenue comes in at harvest, but expenses happen all year. You need enough working capital to cover the lean times, or you need a line of credit to bridge the gap. And then there's personal risk. Farming is physically demanding. Injuries happen. So does burnout. Take care of yourself. Use good safety practices. Don't work yourself to exhaustion. And have a backup plan if you or a key person in your operation is unable to work. Insurance, savings, partnerships, whatever it takes to make sure the farm can keep running if something happens to you. The farmers who survive long-term are the ones who think about risk constantly and build redundancy and resilience into their systems. They don't just hope for the best. They plan for the worst and build buffers. Now let's talk about something that's not sexy, but is absolutely essential. Record keeping. Most farmers are great at the farming part. They know their crops, they know their soil, they know how to grow things. But a lot of them are terrible at keeping records. And that's a huge missed opportunity because good records are one of the most powerful profit tools you have. Here's why. Records let you see patterns. They let you know what's working and what's not. They let you identify your most profitable crops, your most efficient practices, your best market channels. Without records, you're flying blind. You're making decisions based on gut feel and memory. And both of those are notoriously unreliable. Let me give you some examples of what you should be tracking. Production records. When you planted, what varieties, how much you harvested, when you harvested, quality grades. Financial records. Every expense, categorized by type. Seed, fertilizer, labor, fuel, marketing, everything. Every sale by crop, by market channel, by price. Time logs, how many hours you and your crew spent on each task. Weather data, rainfall, temperatures, frost dates. With this data, you can do incredibly valuable analysis. You can calculate your actual cost per unit for each crop. You can see which crops are most profitable. You can see which market channels give you the best return. You can identify inefficiencies. Maybe you're spending way more labor hours on one crop than you thought. Maybe one variety consistently outperforms another. Maybe planting a week earlier gives you better prices. I know a farmer who tracked his time meticulously for a year and discovered he was spending 30% of his labor hours on a crop that only generated 10% of his revenue. That crop was a money loser on a per-hour basis. He dropped it, reallocated that time to his most profitable crops, and his net income went up 20% without farming any more acres. Records also make your life easier at tax time. If you've got everything documented, your accountant can maximize your deductions and minimize your tax burden. And if you ever want to get a loan or bring in investors, good records make you credible. Banks and investors want to see financial statements, production history, profitability analysis. If you can show them solid data, you look professional and trustworthy. So how do you actually do this? Start simple. A spreadsheet is fine. Track your expenses, track your sales, track your production. As you get more sophisticated, you can move to farm management software like FarmOS, FarmBright, or QuickBooks for agriculture. These tools make it easier to organize data and generate reports. The key is consistency. Record things as they happen, not weeks later when you've forgotten the details. Make it a habit. 5 minutes a day of record keeping will save you hours of confusion and guesswork later. Bottom line: good records beat guesswork every time. If you want to improve your profitability, start by measuring what's actually happening on your farm. Alright, we're coming to the end of this segment, and I want to leave you with the most important concept of all. Profitability is not about one magic bullet. It's not about one perfect crop, or one amazing marketing channel, or one piece of technology. Profitability is a system. It's about optimizing the whole farm, not just one piece. Think of your farm as an ecosystem. Everything is connected. Your soil health affects your yields. Your yields affect your revenue. Your input costs affect your margins. Your labor efficiency affects your profitability. Your market selection affects your prices. Your record keeping affects your decision making. It's all interconnected. So if you want to improve profitability, you have to think systemically. You can't just focus on increasing yield and ignore costs. You can't just focus on cutting costs and ignore quality. You can't just focus on one crop and ignore diversification and risk management. You have to optimize across all of these dimensions at once. Here's what that looks like in practice. You do a careful analysis of your costs per unit for every crop you grow. You identify which crops are most profitable. You double down on those and reduce or eliminate the least profitable ones. You look at your input costs and find efficiencies, better irrigation, better fertility management, better pest control. You invest in tools and infrastructure that improve your productivity. You develop multiple market channels so you're not dependent on one buyer. You track your time and find ways to reduce labor hours per unit of production. You build soil health so your yields are more stable and your input needs are lower. You manage risk through diversification, insurance, and financial planning. And you keep detailed records so you can continuously learn and improve. None of these things by themselves will make you profitable. But together as a system, they create a resilient, efficient, and profitable farm operation. I'll give you one last example. A fruit farmer I know spent 5 years systematically optimizing his operation. He switched to drip irrigation, which cut his water costs by 40%. He planted windbreaks, which reduced crop damage and increased yields by 15%. He started selling at farmers markets instead of just wholesale, which doubled his per unit price. He invested in a small cold storage facility, which let him extend his selling season and smooth out price volatility. He tracked his costs obsessively and dropped 2 crops that were marginal and expanded 3 crops that were highly profitable. He built his soil with compost and cover crops, which reduced his fertilizer costs and improved his resilience. The result: his gross revenue went from $120,000 to $250,000 over 5 years. His net profit went from $30,000 to $110,000. He's farming the same number of acres, but he's almost 4 times more profitable because he optimized the whole system. That's the power of thinking systemically about profitability. It's not one decision. It's 100 small decisions, all pointing in the same direction. So here's your takeaway from this segment. Don't obsess over yield to the exclusion of profit. Understand the quality versus quantity trade-offs in your market. Manage price volatility through diversification and smart marketing. Know the difference between gross income and net profit, and track your true costs. Calculate your cost per unit and your break-even point so you know where you stand. Be strategic about scaling. Bigger isn't always better. Manage risk proactively across production, markets, and finances. Keep detailed records because data beats guesswork. And most importantly, think about profitability as a system. Optimize the whole farm, not just one piece. In the next segment, we're going to shift gears and talk about how modern technology is transforming farm economics. We'll explore precision agriculture, data analytics, automation, sensors, drones, and how these tools are helping farmers produce more efficiently and more profitably than ever before. Thanks for sticking with me through this deep dive into the economics of profitability. See you in the next segment.